Now I'm going to touch on all the AKI wrestling games developed for the Nintendo 64, and I have 6 of them in this video. So this first one here is WCW vs NWO World Tour, and it came out in 1997. And to say the least, this game was just fucking awesome. I even remember the first time I played this game. I was about 12 years old and we had rented it from Blockbuster, and we just played the game all night long. In fact, I remember actually skipping school so I can just play this game. Actually, funny story about the game. I used to get the cartridge and put it on a spoon, and then I would freebase it, this way I could smoke it. I mean, it was just that awesome. Really, my only complaint with the game was, it was WCW. Other than that, as far as wrestling games go, this was perfect. So even though it's a complex wrestling game and the characters are capable of doing so much, the way the control works makes this game just very easy and fun to play. Now, being a huge wrestling fan as a kid, this was the first awesome wrestling game we had here in America. And there were some classic wrestling games before this, like Slam Masters, the old acclaimed wrestling games, and WrestleFest and Superstars on the arcade. But this was the first time I played a wrestling game and thought, this feels like an actual wrestling game. And then you could just bust their head open, ram them with a chair, just all kinds of shit. Really, the first true wrestling game I think was the Fire Pro Wrestling series, but those were only in Japan, and we didn't get one here till 2001. So one thing you can definitely say about these AKI wrestling games is they hit the market right on time. So anyway, let me go ahead and talk about the game a little bit. So for N64 standards, the graphics aren't exactly that impressive. In fact, the characters barely look like who they're supposed to be. But the animations of the wrestlers are so spectacular, it kind of doesn't even matter. For wrestling fans, it's important to see these maneuvers pulled off realistically. Because if you look at a game like WWF Attitude or WCW Mayhem, the animations are just so piss poor that you don't even care about pulling off the maneuvers. So when it comes to the gameplay, this is just hands down one of the best wrestling games ever, yet it lacks features and modes. And in the next release, WCW NWO Revenge, they didn't do too much to fix that. It was more of the same. Now the thing about WCW NWO Revenge is it's not a very big update. For the most part, we've got new characters, new moves, and a much larger roster. Also, the graphics have been improved. And on paper that does sound a lot better, but in some cases I actually prefer the last one. And basically a major reason why I like the last release is because we had Japanese wrestlers in it. Now you do have a lot more WCW wrestlers in this one, but look at who these guys are. Do you really want to play as any of them? I mean, if you take out Hayabusa and the Great Suzuki, the game is just crippled. However, they did make up some characters that are pretty decent. Some of my favorites are the ninja character in the game and AKI Man. And I'm not crazy about the secret characters in the game either. You've got Roddy Piper, Billy Kidman, Kanyon, the Faces of Fear, and Kurt Hennig. So of all the secret characters I named, the only ones I really care for are Kurt Hennig and Kanyon. Really, if you're going to ask me, the biggest addition to this game is the WCW presentation. So when it comes to the gaming mechanics, it's pretty much exactly the same. Nevertheless though, it's still an excellent game. I mean, we still put quite a few hours in this cartridge. However, it just was too much of the same to even make the switch. Now I guess when you're looking at this game, you can also just say, if it ain't broken, why fix it? But me, the consumer, looking back in retrospect, I wonder why didn't they sit on this game a little longer and put in some more additions. So even though I love the AKI wrestling games, when I look at all the 4 US releases that came out, this is just one of them I don't care about. So here's my final thoughts. An excellent game, the best of 1998. However, if you play last year's release, you're still getting the same experience. Now fortunately, in the next release, AKI made some great changes. First of all, they lost WCW. That alone was a huge improvement to me. However, even though I prefer the WWF characters in the game, AKI just made the default characters boring to play as. Fortunately though, and what really made this game stand out, is they added an excellent creative player system. Really, I barely even used the actual characters in this game because I was always playing with my created players. And I was actually a really big ECW fan at the time. So I would create wrestlers like Rob Van Dam and Taz, and I would just always play as them. So the creative player was just a huge improvement. It made the game a lot more fun to play. So when you're looking at the new additions from the last release, the creative player stands out the most. And then you've also got some new matches, but for the most part, it's more of the same game. So the entrances are better because it now has the wrestler theme music going on, although the quality of the music is pretty low, but what do you expect for a cartridge? And as you can see, they tried to put the Titantrons in here just using a couple of images, but I think too much attention is brought on them. It shouldn't cover the screen because you just see how low quality they are. So when you get to the gameplay here, you can see really the game hasn't been changed that much. The mechanics are still pretty much exactly the same. However, the WWF games we had before this were Warzone and Attitude. So to have a WWF game that was actually fun was really refreshing. So if I'm going to complain about something, it's still too much of the same, and there's also a lack of modes. I mean, really the only new modes you got in here are Cage Match and Season Mode, and I really don't like to play either. I mean, the cage match is just like a regular match, but in a boring way, and you can't even jump off the top of the cage, you can only fall back with your elbow. And Season Mode is really just a ton of matches that goes on forever so you can unlock the secret characters in the game. So really, when it comes to the gameplay, this can't be beat, but it still makes you desire for more modes and features. With that said, that's kind of something WWF No Mercy went for, which was the next release in the series, and it came out in the year 2000. It was also the last AKI wrestling game we saw. Now, if I didn't mention it enough already, the AKI wrestling series is simply just one of the greatest wrestling series ever made. I love it, I still play it today, it's just great. But my criticism on the series is, as the years went by, it just didn't develop very much. And another thing is, they should not have kept it on the N64. That was a huge mistake if they wanted to bring this game to a large audience. I mean, I'm sure N64 fanboys are glad this was an exclusive title. However, that makes the demand for this game much smaller, and that's probably a big reason why we don't have any more of these. So even though SmackDown was an inferior wrestling game, I'm sure it outsold this game many times over. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that, but let me tell you the differences in this game. So this is really what the updates come down to. You've got much better graphics, still not fantastic. You've got a larger roster, more moves, an enhanced creative player, and you can also go backstage. But the backstage areas are pretty lame. They don't have a whole lot to do back there. Maybe there's a table you could slam your opponent through, but that's really it. Compared to SmackDown 2, they're not very creative. So as I said, when it comes to the updates, it's more of the same, and my problem with the series is it just never developed too much. However, this is an opinion of a guy who's followed the series from day one, so I have criticisms. But if you yet to play any of these wrestling games on the Nintendo 64, I highly recommend you pick this up. A Nintendo 64 is easy to get a hold of, and this game is dirt cheap on eBay. And as you can see from the emulator I'm playing on, this game is emulated pretty much perfectly. So that's all the AKI wrestling games we saw here in the US developed for the Nintendo 64. However, there were also a couple of them released only in Japan. So I plan to only briefly touch on these games, as they are more of the same. But if you want more information on these games, just go ahead and look it up on YouTube. You'll find video. So the first game here is Virtual Pro Wrestling 64, and if it looks familiar, that's just because it's the Japanese version of WCW vs NWO World Tour. Now really the only differences you're going to find in this one is it has a much larger roster of Japanese wrestlers. As you can see, this intro here has been extended. And it also has the costume edit mode that we saw in WCW NWO Revenge. For the larger cast of Japanese wrestlers alone, I actually prefer this version. Unfortunately though, most of the text in this game is also Japanese, so it makes it very difficult to play. So with that said, you're pretty much just better off sticking with the US version. So ultimately, it's just the same game with a few more things in it. And lastly, I'm going to take a look at Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. And this game basically uses the exact same engine we saw in WWF Wrestlemania 2000. And also, they didn't put any wrestlers from US promotions in this game. However, it does have a couple familiar US wrestlers, such as Vader, the Kamala, and Mike Awesome. So once again, I actually do kind of prefer this game over WrestleMania 2000. I mean, it's pretty much exactly the same with a much better cast of wrestlers. But like the other Virtual Pro Wrestling game, a major problem in this one is most of the text is in Japanese as well. And also, just a fun fact, this really isn't the second Virtual Pro Wrestling game. It's really the third in the series. The original Virtual Pro Wrestling came out on the Sony PlayStation in 1996, and it came out here in America as WCW vs. the World. Now, Virtual Pro Wrestling 64 would really be part 2 of the series. So when it comes down to it, I think they're pretty much just neglecting the one that came out on the Sony PlayStation. So I think it would make more sense to call this game Virtual Pro Wrestling 64 2. But anyways, that's just a thought of a guy who follows the series. And since this is so much like WrestleMania 2000, it doesn't make sense to play this game unless you can read the Japanese language. I mean, all the moves in here were also in WrestleMania 2000, and if you don't like the wrestlers in WrestleMania 2000, well, you can just make your own anyway. So the only good reason to play these virtual pro wrestling games is because you're a fan of the series and you just want to see every single fucking game. So I really recommend you just stick with the US version, and if you guys want to see more footage of these games in action, just go ahead and look it up on YouTube. So I hope you enjoyed my look at the AKI Wrestling Games. I think they're simply some of the greatest games ever made. So until next time guys, take it easy.